Good morning. We're going to continue the knife of never letting go. We're going to be talking about some of the things that I believe Ness borrows from the Bible or adapts from the Bible, some of the things he borrows from Shakespeare or adapts from Shakespeare. And we're going to be talking about that all important generic thing, stuff. So let's kind of run through this and take a look at some of the things that go beyond the plot, go beyond the noise, and some of the things that Ness uses to, I think, add layers of meaning to a fairly complex, at least in my humble opinion, young adult novel. Before we get biblical, I had to throw in a scream of "You heathen." It was one of the great joys of my life when I was teaching world literature classes or when I was teaching other classes where biblical allusions were a predominant part of the literature, and students missed the allusion. It was one of the great joys of my life to scream, "You heathen!" Wearing the mask and being at a Catholic institution where sisters might come running into the room and start performing an exorcism, I decided that perhaps it's best not to scream, "You heathen," whether it's on this presentation or in the classroom. Uh, Either way, I still had to write it. You can't take all the joy out of my life. Before we deal with the biblical allusions, I think we need to talk about archetypes. Archetypes are a character, a setting, a symbol, a plot sequence that's basically a universal template. It's been copied throughout many forms of storytelling across most human cultures. Archetypes tend to be universal. And whether we're talking about the knight, the cowboy, or the private detective, they are all basically the same character. They work for a rich person, whether it's called a lord or an employer or the land baron. In the case of the cowboy, they have a specific skill set. Oftentimes, that skill set involves violence. Um, they have specific tools. Uh, the knight has the lance, the cowboy's got a rope, the private detective has the gun or some scientific acumen or whatever it is that allows him to do his job. Many times, their mode of conveyance for the knight and the cowboy, the horse, for a lot of the private detectives, their car, are a big important element of who they are. They're part of their identity. As far as plot details, David versus Goliath. Whether it's the movie The Sandlot or any movie where the small upstart lawyer or the small upstart businessman defeats the big firm, is a David versus Goliath story. And the plot details almost follow the David and Goliath step by step as we go through. Archetypes, I think, are universal and they're important. Depending on the sequence, some of this is kind of a repeat. But the heroic quest might be the most famous archetype of all. And the heroic quest follows a kind of step by step pattern. You've got heroes born in a secret place. You've got heroes who often have to be hidden away because somebody's out to get them. You have heroes who are not fools. I think that's an important element. You have heroes who are not fools, and by fools, once again, I mean they're not foolhardy, but they're also not invincible. If you're impervious to any form of harm, then you cannot be a hero. It's not heroic if you can't be hurt. Heroes are going to have some goal, whether it's to save the maiden or kill the monster, and the hero is going to have trouble figuring out how to best achieve that goal. The hero is going to be surrounded by danger, hence he's a hero. The hero is going to have some friends, but the dirty task is going to have to be done by the hero himself. The hero might have a mentor, somebody who's going to teach him how to be a hero or to get him in the correct mindset of being a hero. The hero might receive some magical or mystical or everyday object that takes on added symbolic significance to help him do his job. The hero is going to have a dark time. And the hero is going to be changed, A lot of times the hero is not going to find what he looks for. Those of you who watched my other presentation, I talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh himself wanted eternal life. But we don't have anybody named Gilgamesh who's lived for thousands of years running around. Symbolically, Gilgamesh has received some form of eternal life because we still talk about him and we still read his story. The hero is often wounded. That might be the reason he has the change. And the heroes are almost always male. They might get guidance. They might get the secrets of life from the woman. The woman might be a mentor, but heroes are usually male. And look, this quest, I think, works for us and is eternal for us because it describes us. Most of us want to think that we are great and unique individuals and that our birth is somehow a symbolic thing. Most of us hope we have the courage to deal with threats that are at hand, but we all realize that we can be hurt. Most of us have dark times in our lives, and it's how we handle those dark times, excuse me, it's how we handle those dark times that determine the kind of people we are. And that's what happens in a lot of the adolescent lit books that we've been talking about throughout this semester and will continue to talk about throughout this semester. But let's get on to the biblical end of this. One of the things I think is important is the idea of Eden. Eden was this perfect creation. We had Adam alone and we had the creation of Eve. There are other elements we'll get to in the next slide, but these are the three first elements. New world was a new world to the humans. It was perhaps a much more perfect place than they're leaving it. The settlers were composed of both men and women who want to return to a simplified life and practice their religion. It wasn't Adam alone. And so, in a lot of ways, we are beginning to see that it is flipped around. And with the creation of Eve, we have the advent of the noise. The Eve was the one responsible for uh, first succumbing to the temptation of the serpent. The noise is the thing that starts driving men mad and starts changing their view of what this society is supposed to look like. We have the temptation of the serpent. Eve was the one tempted. We have the women killed. We have Adam and Eve gaining knowledge of good and evil. We have books and education being banned. They're expelled from the garden, and Prentisstown is exiled to this area behind the swamp. I think you can see that this is flipped. This is totally flipped upside down. Instead of expelled, they're confined. Instead of knowledge, they are looking for ignorance. Instead of the woman being the one tempted, it's the men who are tempted and succumb to temptation and succumb to the violent temptation of killing. And if we want to back up a slide here, the new world may have been close to perfect, but it's the normal world. And again, like I said, it began with Adam alone. Now we have the idea of men and women arriving at the same time. And with the creation of Eve, who changes things, was supposed to be a helper. We have the advent of the noise that could have been helpful, but wasn't. It's a flip flop. It is turning everything on its head. And I think it's one of the things that Ness does throughout the book. He takes things that are familiar and he inverts them, or he does a twist on them in some way or another. And lest you think I'm doing too much, I think it's important to take a look at the idea that Eden was a way of explaining sin. Even Eden was a way of explaining why bad things are happening to good people. Eden is a way of explaining how a perfect God can have an imperfect world. In New World, Aaron is using Eden as part of his madness, part of his way of perverting what should be a far better society than it is. It's going to symbolize the day you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and you go from innocence to sin. That's the way, that's what happened in Eden. But instead of not wanting that to happen, Aaron wants to move people from innocence to sin. Aaron wants to move people from innocence to violence, from innocence to being murderers. The idea of Eden, the idea in Christianity anyway, is that sin happened, but we should try to work to avoid sin. In New World, they are giving into sin, they are giving into violence, they are giving into murder, things that we consider the worst forms of sin. And again, lest you think I'm going too far, Eden is referenced directly in a couple spots. Crops failing, sickness, no prosperity, no Eden. And remember, when people were kicked out of Eden, when Adam and Eve were kicked out of Eden, that's when they were told that they were going to have to work by the sweat of their brow. That's when they were told that there would be sickness. That's when they were told that they would die. It was eating the tree of knowledge of good and evil that led them to their death. And I think it's a sly or slick move on page 404. If you were just landing here and didn't know nothing about nothing, remember, that's the way they were in Eden. That's the way Adam and Eve were. Until they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they knew nothing about nothing. If you know nothing about nothing, you still can be in Eden. You can still be innocent. And so I think Ness is wanting us throughout this novel to think about Adam and Eve, to think about the Garden of Eden, to think about innocence and knowledge and sin. And he's using Eden, whether it's direct references or an inversion of an archetype, an inversion of a story that we should all recognize. A perfect place, and evil occurs, people are cast out, and people can never return to that perfection. That storyline happens over and over, and it's happening here. And then if we don't quite get it through the archetype, through the pattern, I think he hits us over the head with it on page 391 and page 404. Then there's Aaron. And again, I think we are having things inverted. There are some obvious similarities. Aaron is the brother of Moses. Moses is the leader who takes the children of Israel from Egypt to the River Jordan, just to the end of the promised land before Joshua leads them over the river into the promised land. Aaron's the confidant of the mayor. Aaron had Moses' ear in the Bible. Aaron has the mayor's ear here in the book. And Ben explains that when he talks about how Elizabeth was killed. He's Moses' mouthpiece in the Bible. In the book, he's called God's very own mouthpiece. He's picking the exact words from the Bible and using them to apply to Aaron. Aaron was the high priest in Exodus chapter 28, if you want to double check my references. He's the holy man. Todd's mom calls him the holy man. Again, this idea of the high priest, the preacher, the one who is the confidant of the leader, um, and he's the one who is the mouthpiece, the one who's going to do the speaking. If we go a step further, in the Bible, Aaron carried a rod or a staff that became a snake, that turned water to blood, that sprouted buds, blossoms, and almonds. And that staff was a big thing in the book. There are several mentions of it, but the ones that stick out in my mind are the times he uses that staff to hit Todd upside the head and to beat Viola. That use of the staff to turn them bloody, just like water was turned to blood by Aaron in the Bible, again, I think are allusions that, if Ness doesn't want us to think about them, are things that he definitely borrowed. Um, a couple of the other ones, I don't think he went that far, and let's face it, that sprouts, buds, and blossoms and almonds, I think is a pretty obscure allusion. Um, so he's probably going for only the obvious. And then Aaron was not perfect. In the Bible, he's the one who constructs the golden calf while Moses was on Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments. And Aaron is the one who leads Prentisstown from innocence to sin. Aaron is the one who goes stark raving mad and advocates the killing of the women. Aaron is the one who basically is responsible for turning away from the simple good life that they came to New World for into this perverted, despicable life of slaughter, and subjugation. Sin is sin in these two cases, whether it's worshiping the golden calf or worshiping the noise and leading people astray. Both Aarons are responsible for that. Aaron made a sacrifice for atonement for himself, and here's where things start getting upside down. Aaron wants to be the sacrifice. Aaron wants Todd to kill him. And because he wants to be this sacrifice, because he wants Todd to kill him, again, I think it's a link to the biblical making the sacrifice for atonement for himself and his people. Aaron doesn't want atonement. Aaron wants sacrificing to be done to continue to lead people away from innocence to sin. Todd, the last boy, can be the boy who goes from the complete and total innocence into the sin. And the best way to do that is to kill Aaron, is to kill the holy man. Aaron did not get to enter the promised land because of the golden calf and because of his sin. Aaron does not enter Haven, nor does he become the sacrifice he intended. Again, it seems to me, and those of you who are doing the presentations, you certainly can say Collis is reading too much into it. I'll argue with you that I'm not. But I think if you take a look at Eden and you take a look at the Bible, Ness is borrowing not just the names, not just the plot details, but he is using the names and using the plot details to invert the story, to show this is what happens if you take what something was supposed to teach people how to be good and try to teach people how to be evil, at least in the novel. This is what happens when you do that. This is what happens when you twist scripture or when you twist any holy writing. Ness also borrows from Shakespeare. In the 12th Night, we have Viola. She is shipwrecked on Illyria. Viola crash lands in the New World. Viola in Shakespeare pretends to be a man named Cesaro. She does impersonations of a man named Wilf. Both characters are smart and resourceful. I think that this is a setup for the second and third novel, that the name becomes more important in the second and third novel as we kind of keep going here. But Ness is taking a Shakespearean name, a Shakespearean character, and developing them further. And I can't remember if I pronounced her name correctly. We'll just move on and hope I did. This is one that I have a question about. I might be totally wrong here. But I do wonder if Ness was trying to make an analogy for America or America. In the U.S., the Puritans arrived at Plymouth for religious reasons. The settlers to New World are coming also for religious reasons. Hildy makes that very, very clear in the novel. I think having Aaron be a key element of the settlement of New Elizabeth is part of that. There are different religious colonies, Far Branch, on and on. They all kind of split off. Some of that was because of how Prentisstown went over the top, but they all kind of split off. Roger Williams founded Rhode Island for religious freedom. He didn't think that the Puritans were in Massachusetts were practicing religion properly. He was persecuted in Massachusetts, and he founds Rhode Island for religious freedom. The war with the Spackle, the series of wars with the Native Americans, seems to me that there's a lot of similarities. The effort to exterminate seemed to be part of both situations. The giant cows and the buffalo. Again, perhaps I'm stretching a little bit, but it seems to me if the first two or three are pretty hard to refute, it's entirely possible that the next one is also something that Ness was trying to get people to think about. The women were killed in Prentisstown. Abigail Adams wrote her husband John Adams and presumably talked to her son John Quincy Adams. Both men became presidents of the United States. Uh, you know, remember the ladies. America didn't do a good job of that. The United States didn't give women the right to vote until the 1920s. From 1787 with the Constitution until the 1920s is a long time. It's not murder, but it's a long time. And there seems to be a big divide between rural areas like Prentisstown or Far Branch and the city of Haven. For example, the city of Haven had the cure for the noise. Um, the people in Far Branch Hildy said it was just a rumor and a myth and didn't believe it. And again, I think in the United States, there's a huge urban-rural divide. And that urban-rural divide colors what kind of television people watch. For example, rural areas are far more likely to watch professional wrestling than urban areas. Uh, there's a whole list of programming and food preferences that split rural and urban. And this is not new. In the late 1960s, CBS had a whole list of programs like the Andy Griffith Show and the Gomer Pyle Show and the Beverly Hillbillies. And they basically canceled all of them. It was kind of a slaughter of rural type programming as they started moving to programs that were set in the cities and had an urban feel to it. And there was a backlash for a while because of that. So it's entertainment, food, um, lots of other things where there's an urban rural divide. And again, that's happening in the novel as well. And it does make me wonder if that's what Ness was trying to get across. So as we keep going here, he turns Eden upside down. He takes Aaron and he twists it and I think inverts the character. He borrows Viola and it's kind of the same thing. And then he takes the United States, and at least in my mind, he kind of pushes that as the same thing as if he's trying to make a point about, this is where things can be going. This is one way to think about it. So I think it's important to understand that archetypes and illusions are layered through this young adult novel. Okay, we're going to stop it right here. We're going to pick up the bits and pieces for the next one. If you haven't already, please go watch the video that covers the heroic quest archetype. It gives you some concrete details about what the heroic quest archetype should look like. And I'll see you guys in class next time.